The crimson sun rose over the vast Pacific Ocean on the morning of June 4th, 1942, casting long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey stood at the edge of the carrier, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the endless blue expanse, lay Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that would soon become the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in human history. The air buzzed with tension as sailors and pilots prepared for what Admiral Chester Nimitz had called the battle that will determine the fate of the Pacific. McCluskey knew the odds were stacked against them. The Japanese combined fleet, led by the legendary Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was approaching with 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of support vessels. The Americans had only 3 operational carriers and a handful of land-based aircraft. At Midway itself, 6 months had passed since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust America into World War II. The Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, conquering the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and countless island chains. Their naval aviation was considered the finest in the world, their pilots veterans of the China campaign with hundreds of combat hours. The Zero fighter was feared throughout the Pacific for its speed and maneuverability, but the Americans possessed something the Japanese did not know they had: intelligence. Commander Joseph Rockford and his team of codebreakers at Station HYPO had cracked the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. They knew Yamamoto's plan, a massive assault on Midway, designed to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in decisive battle. What the Japanese admiral didn't realize was that his enemy was reading his mail. Admiral Nimitz had positioned his forces carefully. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and centered on the Enterprise and Hornet, lay northeast of Midway. Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown, held position nearby. The trap was set, but success depended on timing, luck, and the courage of young men who would soon climb into their aircraft and fly toward an uncertain fate. As referenced in the comprehensive Pacific War archives maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shift the balance of power in the Pacific. The Japanese possessed superior numbers and experience, but the Americans had preparation and determination on their side. McCluskey turned from the rail and walked toward the ready room where his dive bomber pilots waited. These men, many barely out of their teens, would carry the hopes of a nation on their wings. The dauntless dive bombers they flew were sturdy aircraft, capable of delivering a 1,000-pound bomb with devastating accuracy, but they were also sitting ducks for Japanese fighters if caught without escort. The morning briefing had been sobering. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would launch their first strike against Midway at dawn, attempting to neutralize the airfield before the American carriers could respond. It was a sound strategy, one that had worked perfectly at Pearl Harbor. But this time, the Americans would be ready. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4th, the Japanese carrier Akagi began launching aircraft into the pre-dawn darkness. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 1st Air Fleet from Akagi's bridge, watched with satisfaction as 108 bombers and fighters roared into the sky, bound for Midway Atoll, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now prepared to deliver another devastating blow to American naval power. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave toward Midway, his level bomber cutting through the tropical air at 8,000 feet. Behind him flew 27 Nakajima B-5N bombers, 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. It was a formidable force, one that had proven unstoppable across the Pacific. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the campaigns in Southeast Asia, flew with the confidence born of repeated victory. But as the Japanese strike force approached Midway, American radar operators on the atoll detected the incoming formation. At a range of 93 miles, air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as pilots scrambled to their aircraft. 26 Marine fighters, a mixture of obsolete F-2F Brewster Buffaloes and newer F-4F Wildcats, climbed desperately toward the attacking force. The aerial battle over Midway began at 0620 hours with a thunderous crash of cannon fire and machine guns. The Marine pilots, though outgunned and flying inferior aircraft, fought with desperate courage. Major Floyd Parks, leading BMF 221, dove his Buffalo into a formation of Japanese bombers, his guns blazing. But the Zeros were too fast, too maneuverable. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down. Despite the fierce resistance, Tomonaga's bombers broke through to their target. High explosive and incendiary bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel storage tanks, and defensive positions. The powerhouse that supplied electricity to the island took a direct hit, and fires raged across the installation. Yet the runway remained operational, and many of the American aircraft had already taken off or been dispersed to safety. As the Japanese planes turned for home, Tomonaga radioed a message that would prove crucial. There is need for a second attack. The airfield was damaged, but not destroyed. American aircraft were still operating from Midway, and the island's defenses remained largely intact. Unknown to Nagumo, this assessment would force a decision that would alter the course of the battle. Meanwhile, the American carriers had launched their own strikes. At 07:05, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, took off toward the Japanese fleet. These 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers represented obsolete technology slow, lumbering aircraft that required a straight-hand level approach to drop their torpedoes. But they carried the only weapons capable of sinking the Japanese carriers. The courage of these airmen cannot be overstated. They knew their aircraft were outclassed, their chances of survival slim, yet they flew toward almost certain death because duty and honor demanded it. Waldron, a Partsu Indian from South Dakota, had told his men before takeoff, "We will go in. We will not turn back. We may not get hits, but we will go in." His words would prove prophetic. As the morning sun climbed higher, 3 separate dramas were unfolding across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. On Midway, damage control parties fought fires and cleared debris from the runway. In the sky above the Japanese fleet, American torpedo bombers pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. And aboard the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced the most important decision of his career. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, his weathered face creased with concentration as he weighed the most critical decision of his naval career. The morning attack on Midway had succeeded partially, but Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message requesting a second strike created a deadly dilemma. Half of Nagumo's aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships the American carriers, his intelligence assured him, were still at Pearl Harbor. The other half had already returned from the Midway strike, their fuel tanks nearly empty. At 07:15, Nagumo made his fateful choice. He ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway. In the hangar decks below, Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons, a procedure that would take nearly an hour to complete. Torpedoes were wheeled away from the Nakajima bombers, while 1,000-pound bombs were rolled into position. But at 07:28, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone radioed a message that sent shock waves through the First Air Fleet. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position 10 degrees distance to 140 miles from Midway. American naval vessels, possibly including carriers, were much closer than anyone had believed possible. The blood drained from Nagumo's face as he absorbed this information. If American carriers were indeed present, his own ships were in mortal danger. He immediately ordered the rearming process reversed, but precious time had already been lost. On the hangar decks, confusion reigned as ordnance crews struggled to reload torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, while the first wave aircraft demanded immediate refueling and rearming. At 08:09, lookouts aboard Akagi spotted the first wave of American attackers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron. It approached at low altitude, their obsolete aircraft struggling to maintain formation. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his men straight into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol, knowing it was almost certainly suicide, but determined to press the attack. The slaughter was swift and merciless. Zero fighters dove on the slow-moving Devastators like hawks attacking sparrows. One by one, the American torpedo bombers exploded into flames or cartwheeled into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall. The squadron commander's last radio transmission a defiant watched those fighters. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived the attack, floating in the ocean amid the wreckage of his aircraft. But Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice was not in vain. Their low-level attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude airspace temporarily undefended. At 09:20, as Japanese pilots celebrated their victory over the torpedo planes, another formation appeared high above the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise had found their target at last. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low. Following a hunch, he had turned north and spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet. That single wake had led him to the greatest prize in naval warfare for enemy aircraft carriers, caught in the vulnerable act of rearming and refueling their aircraft. From 17,000 feet, McCluskey could see the Japanese carriers spread out below like toys on a pond. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines sneaking across the wooden planking, ordnance scattered about from the rearming process. It was a dive bomber pilot's dream and a carrier admiral's nightmare. "This is it, boys," McCluskey radioed to his squadrons. "Target the carriers. Remember, make it count." 3rd to 7th BD Dauntless dive bombers rolled over into their attack dives, their Pratt and Whitney engines howling as they plummeted toward the Japanese fleet. In the next 5 minutes, the tide of the Pacific War would turn forever. At 09:25 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. Below him, the enemy flight deck grew larger with each passing second, crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. Fuel hoses snaked across the wooden planking like arteries pumping lifeblood into waiting bombers and fighters. It was the perfect target for a dive bomber attack. McCluskey's 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga near the island's superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion touched off a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation gasoline and ordnance ignited throughout the ship. Within moments, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was transformed into a raging inferno. Her flight deck buckled and torn, her hangar spaces filled with flames and choking smoke. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Dick Best led his section of 3 Dauntless bombers toward the flagship Akagi. Best, known throughout the fleet for his precision bombing, held his dive longer than regulation allowed, releasing his bomb from just 1,500 feet. Admiral Nagumo barely escaped with his life as his flagship became an uncontrollable pyre. The attack on Soryu was equally devastating. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's bombing squadron from Yorktown had arrived at the same crucial moment, their dive bombers screaming down through the clear morning sky. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the carrier into a floating torch. Her aviation gasoline tanks ruptured, sending rivers of flaming fuel cascading through the ship's compartments. According to declassified after-action reports housed in the National Archives, this 5-minute period would later be called the Miracle at Midway by American historians. In the span of 300 seconds, 3 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers had been mortally wounded. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and swept across the Pacific were now swimming in oil-covered water, or trapped in the twisted wreckage of their ships. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of Soryu chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge as flames consumed the carrier around him. His final signal to the fleet was a simple message: "Long live the Emperor." Similar scenes of sacrifice and honor played out aboard Kaga and Akagi as damaged control parties fought hopeless battles against fires that could not be contained. But one Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, positioned slightly apart from the main formation, had escaped the initial American attack. Her captain, Tomio Kaku, immediately began preparing to counterstrike. At 10:40, 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, bound for the American carriers. Leading this desperate mission was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of Japan's most experienced dive bomber pilots. The Americans had paid a terrible price for their success. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 had survived. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually annihilated, with only Ensign George Gay living to tell the tale. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown had suffered almost as severely, their obsolete TBD Devastators no match for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Yet the sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews had been crucial to the American victory. Their low-level attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down from altitude, leaving the skies clear for McCluskey's dive bombers to make their devastating attack. Without the courage of men like John Waldron and his squadron, the Battle of Midway might have ended very differently. As smoke billowed from the burning Japanese carriers, Admiral Spruance faced his own critical decision. Should he press his advantage and pursue the retreating Japanese fleet, or should he withdraw to protect his own carriers? The Battle of Midway was far from over, and one Japanese carrier still remained to exact revenge. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi gripped the controls of his Aichi D3 dive bomber as he led 18 aircraft toward the American fleet. Behind him, the smoke from 3 burning Japanese carriers rose like funeral pyres against the azure Pacific sky. The pride of the combined fleet Akagi Kaga, and Sori lay dying in the water, victims of American dive bombers that had struck like lightning from a clear sky. But Hiryu remained operational, and Captain Tomio Kaku was determined to extract revenge. "We will show the Americans that the Imperial Japanese Navy does not yield easily," he had told Kobayashi before takeoff. The veteran pilot, who had flown over Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, knew this might be Japan's last chance to salvage something from the disaster at Midway. At 12:05, Kobayashi's formation spotted the American carriers. USS Yorktown, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, presented an irresistible target. The Japanese dive bombers rolled into their attack, their fixed landing gear giving them a distinctive silhouette against the tropical sky. Yorktown's radar had detected the incoming strike, but there was barely time to launch fighters before the enemy arrived. The attack on Yorktown was executed with a precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of smoke, 3 bombs struck the American carrier. One penetrated the flight deck near the island, another hit amidships, and a third exploded in the forward elevator well. Fires erupted throughout the ship as damage control parties rushed to contain the blaze. Captain Elliot Buckmaster fought to save his ship as Yorktown listed to port, her speed dropping to 6 knots. The carrier had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, limping back to Pearl Harbor with severe damage. 63 days of round-the-clock repairs had returned her to fighting condition, but now she was mortally wounded once again. Yet the Americans struck back with devastating effect. At 2:45, 24 SPD Dauntless bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu attempting to launch a second strike. 3 more direct hits followed in rapid succession, each one adding to the inferno that consumed the last operational Japanese carrier. Captain Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, watching flames engulf his ship. Like his counterparts on the other carriers, he chose to remain aboard, sending a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Hiryu is on fire and can no longer operate aircraft. We are abandoning ship at 1900 hours." The last of the Pearl Harbor strike force was dying in the same waters, where she had achieved her greatest triumph. As detailed in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations. In World War II, the loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day represented an unprecedented disaster for the Imperial Japanese Navy. These ships had taken years to build, and their experienced air crews even longer to train. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan had lost the offensive capability that had carried her to victory across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, received the devastating reports with stoic calm. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his grand strategy had failed catastrophically. The plan to draw out and destroy the American carriers had instead resulted in the virtual elimination of Japan's own carrier force. At 2:55 that afternoon, Yamamoto issued the painful order: "The Midway operation is canceled. All forces will withdraw." But the Americans were not finished. Admiral Spruance, now commanding Task Force 16 after Fletcher's withdrawal to coordinate damage control on Yorktown, made a crucial decision. Rather than pursue the retreating Japanese fleet into potentially dangerous waters, he would consolidate his victory and protect his remaining carriers. It was a decision that would be vindicated by subsequent events. The sun set on June 4, 1942, illuminating a Pacific Ocean littered with the wreckage of Japanese ambition. For carriers lay sinking or burned-out hulks, their flight decks twisted and blackened. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots had perished, men who could not be replaced. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered forever. In the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, dawn broke gray and overcast on June 5, 1942, as Admiral Raymond Spruance peered through his binoculars from the bridge of USS Enterprise. The previous day's victory had been decisive, but the Battle of Midway was not yet over. Somewhere to the west, Admiral Yamamoto's massive fleet was retreating toward Japan, licking wounds that would take years to heal. Yet Spruance knew that wounded animals could still be dangerous, especially when cornered. The crippled Yorktown remained afloat, though barely. Throughout the night, damage control parties had fought flooding and fires while the carrier's list grew steadily worse. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered the ship abandoned at 5:07 the previous evening, but destroyer USS Hughes stood by, her crew hoping the famous carrier might yet be saved. Yorktown had become a symbol of American resilience, damaged at Coral Sea, repaired in record time, and now fighting for her life once again. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance faced a critical decision. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese submarines were converging on the battle area, drawn by radio transmission and the promise of crippled American vessels. The I-1-6-8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, was already stalking through the waters where Yorktown lay helpless. Should Spruance risk his remaining carriers in a pursuit of the retreating enemy, or should he consolidate his forces and protect what he had gained? The answer came from an unexpected source. At 0615, APBY Catalina flying boat reported spotting the Japanese heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma limping westward after a collision during the night withdrawal. Both ships were damaged and vulnerable, presenting an irresistible target for American dive bombers. Here was an opportunity to extend the victory without risking the precious carriers. Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson led 31 SBD Dauntless bombers from Enterprise toward the Japanese cruisers. The Japanese cruisers, which had terrorized merchant shipping across the Pacific, were now helpless prey. But as Johnson's dive bombers celebrated their success, tragedy struck the American fleet. At 1:36 that afternoon, I-168's periscope broke the surface near the drifting Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe had stalked his prey with infinite patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His spread of 4 torpedoes raced through the clear water toward the carrier. At her escort, destroyer USS Hammond, the explosions that followed sealed Yorktown's fate. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier amidships, the massive detonations breaking her keel and flooding her engine rooms. Hammond, caught alongside while providing power to the carrier, was literally broken in half by a torpedo that detonated directly under her hull. The destroyer sank within minutes, taking 80 of her crew with her. Yorktown rolled slowly to port as her compartments flooded, the Fighting Lady finally succumbing to wounds that no damage control party could heal. AT-0701 on June 6th, she slipped beneath the Pacific swells, taking with her the hopes of salvage, but not the memory of her gallant fight. Captain Buckmaster, who had remained aboard until the final moments, was among the survivors picked up by escorting destroyers. The submarine attack set shock waves through the American fleet. Spruance immediately ordered his carriers to withdraw eastward, away from the submarine-infested waters around Midway. The victory was complete, but vigilance remained essential. Japanese submarines continued to prowl the area for weeks, hoping to catch unwary American vessels. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring events from his flagship Yamato, received news of Yorktown sinking with grim satisfaction. It was small compensation for the loss of her fleet carriers, but at least the Americans had paid a price for their victory. The commander, who had planned Pearl Harbor, now faced the bitter task of explaining to Emperor Hirohito how Japan's most powerful fleet had been destroyed by an enemy supposedly in retreat, as referenced in official Japanese naval records preserved in Tokyo's military archives. The Midway defeat marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The nation that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier was now forced onto the defensive. Her carrier aviation decimated and her strategic initiative permanently lost. The hunters had become the hunted, and the tide of war had turned irrevocably against the rising sun. The tropical sun blazed down mercilessly on the oil-slicked waters northwest of Midway Atoll. As the final act of the great naval battle played out, June 7, 1942, found Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard his flagship Yamato, staring at the horizon where 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers had met their doom. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year, was now confronting the bitter reality of his prophecy. The butcher's bill was catastrophic for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the backbone of the First Air Fleet, lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, taking with them over 300 aircraft and the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Captains Aoki, Okada, and Yanagimoto had gone down with their ships, while Admiral Nagumo had been forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara in humiliating defeat. The heavy cruiser Mikuma joined the carriers on the ocean floor, victim of American dive bombers who had pursued the retreating fleet with relentless determination. But beyond the ships and planes, Japan had lost something even more precious: the irreplaceable pilots who had carried the rising sun to victory across the Pacific. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, lay wounded aboard a hospital ship. His flying days ended by shrapnel from an American bomb. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, the torpedo specialist who had crippled Battleship Row, was among the dead. These men represented years of training and combat experience that could never be adequately replaced. The American victory came at a steep price as well. USS Yorktown rested on the Pacific floor alongside destroyer Hammond, their hulks testament to Japanese submarine warfare that remained deadly even in defeat. 150 American airmen had perished in the battle, many in the obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that had pressed home suicidal attacks against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice had not been in vain by drawing Japanese fighters to low altitude. They had cleared the sky for the dive bombers that delivered the killing blows. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber leader whose navigation skills had found the Japanese fleet at the crucial moment, would receive the Navy Cross for his role in the victory. His decision to turn north after his fuel began running low had led him to the enemy carriers at precisely the moment when they were most vulnerable. Such moments of inspired leadership often determine the outcome of great battles. As detailed in the official Navy Department communique released on June 8th, the Battle of Midway represented a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from Pearl Harbor, had gambled everything on the intelligence provided by his codebreakers. The victory vindicated his faith in men like Commander Joseph Rockford, whose ability to read Japanese naval codes had provided the Americans with an unprecedented strategic advantage. The broader implications of Midway extended far beyond the tactical details of the battle itself. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken. Her plans for expansion into the Central Pacific permanently derailed. The planned assault on Port Moresby was canceled, removing the threat to Australia. More importantly, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese arms since Pearl Harbor was shattered forever. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster by Admiral Osamu Nagano, received the news in stony silence. The divine ruler, who had been told of victory after victory for 6 months, now confronted the reality that his forces were not invincible. The war that Japanese leaders had expected to conclude with a negotiated peace was now destined to continue for years, with an increasingly powerful America mobilizing its industrial might against the island nation. Admiral Spruance, promoted to full admiral for his tactical brilliance at Midway, would later reflect on the battle's significance. The enemy had lost the flower of his carrier air power. We had gained the initiative in the Pacific, and we never lost it thereafter. His words proved prophetic as American forces began their long advance across the Pacific, island by island, toward the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Midway had indeed altered the course of the Pacific War, and for days of fighting, the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably in America's favor. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was now fully roused, its industrial power and military potential directed toward the complete defeat of Japanese militarism. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but it began in the waters northwest of a tiny coral atoll called Midway, where American courage and Japanese overconfidence had collided with devastating results for the Empire of the Rising Sun.